Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We've just held the latest meeting of the Greater Manchester COVID Emergency Committee, and this is our regular update for you. We've also been sadly shocked by the sudden loss of a young lad from Salford, 14-year-old Adam Kay, over the last 24 hours. Seems so Adam drowned in Clifton Country Park. Going to be joined by Mayor Paul Dennett soon. I'm sure Paul will want to say something extra about that, as well as Baroness Beverly Hughes as well. But obviously all of our thoughts are with Adam's family and the local community. I'll start by just giving an overview as to where we're up to. Again, we're seeing a decline in cases across Greater Manchester. So the latest figures are 190 cases over the last week, which is the lowest we've seen since the start of the pandemic. But sadly, 58 deaths in Greater Manchester hospitals over the last week. And of course, all of our thoughts are with all of the families concerned. Numbers of people in hospital. There is a slightly more mixed picture. The number of patients in intensive care has increased very slightly, but only slightly. It's gone from 65 last week to 67 yesterday. But that's obviously it's been for many weeks. In terms of patients in hospital, but not in intensive care, patients with COVID, but not in intensive. That's gone down from 591 last week to 523. So you can see the direction here quite clearly, although there is one statistic that I always mention at these briefings, and again I have my eye on it because I have a concern. It's the figure for the number of daily hospital admissions, and it is running as of yesterday at 29 per day. That's up from 25 last week, and I think it was 18 the week before. So it's obviously too early to call it a trend, but it's something to watch, and we are watching it very closely indeed. More broadly, the number of patients in hospital beds has risen, so bed occupancy in Greater Manchester has gone up from 70% to 73%, and that's not a negative thing. We think that's positive because we're beginning to see the return of more normal activity in hospitals and perhaps more patients seeking support. So that's something which we think is a positive. On care homes, also an improving picture. The number of care homes who have one resident or more with an infection is currently 22%. That's down from 28% last week. But having said that, we've had 13 more alerts sent to Public Health England in the last week. So I think when it comes to care homes, again, there are grounds for optimism in terms of the way things are going. But obviously we need to remain to be very vigilant, given that we continue to see new issues within care homes in Greater Manchester. There are two points of substance I want to address today before I invite the Deputy Mayor to speak, and then after Bev, Mayor Paul Dennett. The first is the whole question of contact tracing linked to what the government are now calling local outbreak management plans, or the phrase that we've seen in the media, local lockdowns. Firstly, let me just talk about contact tracing. Certainly some really good progress to report here. We were joined this morning by the Northwest Regional Director of Public Health England, who described Greater Manchester's emerging system on contact tracing as the best in the country, and we were very proud to hear that, and we know that some good work has been carried out here over the last few weeks. So we're in a strong position. We are beginning to receive notifications from the national contact tracing system. The latest figure that we have, and I just want to make sure I get this right, is 73 referrals from the national contact tracing system. So that shows that the system is beginning to work and is passing work from the national level to colleagues in Greater Manchester. And of course, those numbers we expect to increase as we go forward. The significant concern I want to raise today, and this is shared by all of our leaders, is the local lockdown policy announced by the government last week. We think this is fraught with difficulties, and we have serious concerns about it. At the moment, we don't have a great deal of detail as to how it would work in practice. The government have spoken of it not necessarily just being linked to a single building or institution, but could be imposed over a wide geographical area. It's not clear who would make that decision or how it would be enforced. And we think there are major difficulties with that. What is the emerging thinking in Greater Manchester is that we want to develop our own principles about this and work with our communities rather than talk of putting our communities under lockdown, which would, as I've said, be very difficult to manage. We think we need to empower people with more information. We then need to work with communities where the risks are greatest and support them, getting out positive health messaging. And we think that is a better approach than talking of local lockdowns. We need to see the publication of more information. I reiterate my call for the publication by the government of the regional R number, so communities can see the picture as it varies across England. But we think we need to now go further and provide more localised information with regard to the areas where we think spread of the virus is greatest and therefore the risks are highest. And it's about empowering people with information and then working with them to ensure that we manage those risks is a better approach, in our view, than talking of local lockdowns. The second issue I just want to raise is actually not necessarily about COVID, but obviously a reflection on events in the United States over the last week and the callous murder of George Floyd on the streets of Minneapolis. The shockwaves of what happened have been felt powerfully and painfully here in Greater Manchester over the last 7 days. And as a group of community leaders, we wanted to send a message today to our own black community here in Greater Manchester that we understand the anger and the anguish that is being felt. People are tired of discrimination and they want to see change as a result of this. What we've agreed today is to issue a strong Greater Manchester statement, which you will see published later this afternoon, detailing some of the things that we will take as a result of what has been happening over the last 7 days. Of course, part of it is a show of solidarity with George Floyd's family, the community in Minneapolis, communities across the US that are suffering right now, but also here, the black community in Greater Manchester, but across the UK. We've agreed that on Friday evening, we will light up buildings in a show of solidarity across all of Greater Manchester in all of our 10 boroughs, and all of the leaders agreed to that. But we also know we need to do more than that. Just shows of support, they're important, but they're nowhere near enough. And the feeling amongst our leaders was that we need to reflect ourselves on what more we need to do to address the inequalities that we see and the discrimination that isn't just confined to the US, but is experienced by the black community here too. So we've made some commitments today, and I'll just briefly take you through those. We want a stronger dialogue with the black community, recognising that they are underrepresented in political and public life in Greater Manchester. And specifically, we want to work with Operation Black Votes leadership programme to improve representation, as well as having a wider discussion with community organisations about the issues that we need to address. And that's the first commitment we're making, to initiate a new dialogue. Secondly, we recognise that the inequalities faced by many communities in Greater Manchester are structural and deep-seated, and they need to be addressed in that knowledge. We've seen obviously the report of the Public Health England Inequalities Work Group over the last 24 hours, and this brings out the same picture, that there are communities that face much higher levels of health inequality because of the circumstances with regard to work, housing, and of course representation. So in response to that, we will bring forward next month our proposal to establish a Greater Manchester Race Equality Panel to ensure that all of the work in Greater Manchester with regard to devolution has the consideration of race equality at its heart. Thirdly, to ensure that all our communities receive equal treatment from Greater Manchester Police, the Deputy Mayor and myself, with support from the leaders, are committing to publish a quarterly race equality policing report on the use of policing powers across different communities. And we believe by giving this greater level of transparency, we will also improve accountability and hopefully confidence in policing in all of our communities. So I just wanted to mention that because this is a statement that Greater Manchester will be issuing later today. It is a recognition of the fact that showing support are important, but actually what will mean more to our own black communities here in Greater Manchester is the commitment to act on the events of recent days. We have a long tradition in Greater Manchester of confronting discrimination and racism head on, and we are drawing on that tradition in making this statement today, and we commit to act on the things that I've just mentioned. So I will leave it there for now. I will hand over now to Deputy Mayor Baroness Beverly Hughes, who in turn will hand over to Mayor Paul Dennett. Beverly.
Thank you very much, Andy. I just want to start by adding my sincere condolences to the family of Adam, who sadly died yesterday in an incident in open water in which both the fire service and the police service made their very best efforts to find him. Eventually they did, but unfortunately it was too late. And that's a really, really very sad event for all of us, but particularly for that family. Just before I give a rundown on kind of what's been happening, particularly in relation to our emergency services, I think I'll preface it by saying that I think what we've seen over recent days and the last week in particular is really, in my view, the consequence of a significant weakening now of the government's messaging on what people need to do to stay safe. Contradictory messages around that, putting the responsibility wholly on individuals for making their own decisions about physical distancing, instead of having a very, very clear and strong message, which the vast majority of people were wholly signed up to for a long time. And I think that level of contradiction now means, perhaps for understandable reasons, certain groups in our community, maybe young people, but not only young people at all, are now feeling that the signals come from government that they can decide for themselves what it's appropriate to do. And we saw over recent days, as I say, the consequence of that, with the fire service and the police service and others having to respond. I just mentioned the sad event that led to Adam's death. That was one. We've also seen the fire service fighting a number of very significant moorland, peat fire, grass fires, 3 across Greater Manchester. They're also supporting South Yorkshire in fighting a very significant moorland fire. That's taken a lot of engines and firefighters to deal with those incidents. We've still been able to deal with local issues as well. But it's just a reflection, I think, of the different levels of activity now that are going on and the kind of consequences that can arise. I hesitate to say that, you know, the fires have been caused by human behaviour. The causes of those fires are still being investigated. But it is a fact that once people get to be more active in those kinds of situations, particularly where it's very dry and there's been a lot of sunshine for a long period of time, then the potential for fires to start is even greater, and that's actually what we're seeing. We had quite a long discussion with all the leaders today about what's been happening in local areas, and that reflects what we at the GM level are seeing in Greater Manchester Police. That is that, you know, lockdown has pretty much ended, certainly as far as organised crime and other people whose criminal activities have been dormant over recent weeks during lockdown now becoming much more active. So levels of crime generally steadily rising, and organised crime, we're seeing firearm incidents, very serious assaults increasing, and that's also reflected, we heard from leaders in great detail today, in levels of antisocial behaviour and other problematic activity in local areas. There are a few incidents of very large gatherings with music, raves in different parts of Greater Manchester over the weekend. And we had a very open discussion really about how we can respond to that, because it is difficult. Clearly, many of those situations do contravene what are still actually the conventions on keeping 2 meters away from people. And yet when large gatherings take place like that, the potential for the police to intervene and disperse is actually limited, and we need to have an honest conversation, I think, with the public about what are the limits of that kind of intervention. We think there's clearly things that we can do in partnership with local authorities, with their community safety personnel and others, thinking particularly about young people. But I think we also need to get back here in Greater Manchester and reinforce more strongly again those messages, which are public health messages, as well as messages about avoiding antisocial behaviour, about keeping your distance and not being in large gatherings. And I think, you know, that's a really important thing for us to do. So we are seeing, as I say, some of the adverse consequences of the weakening of the messaging from government. It's demonstrating itself in various aspects of social behaviour now across Greater Manchester. The police will respond to that where they can. And as I say, we'll work with local partners to deal with local issues as they identify them. But I think it is really regrettable that we've got such contradictory now messages from government, and it's making the management of the issues locally. You know, we're still having a lot of people clearly demonstrating that they are anxious about the current situation. They want the message about staying at home or mixing in very small groups to be reinforced, and they are increasingly upset when they say others contravening that and perhaps putting everybody at risk by very large gatherings. So we're getting perhaps the emergence of almost kind of two groups within the population at the moment, and it will be the police and local authorities that are trying to negotiate and deal with that. But it's not a situation of our making, but we will do our best to respond for the citizens of Greater Manchester. Thanks, Andy. So now over to Mayor Dennett.
Thank you very much, Mayor Burnham and Baroness Hughes. Really appreciate it. And like yourselves, I just want to echo your words. My thoughts and prayers are with Adam Kay's family and friends at this time and his loved ones. It was tragic news yesterday in the city of Salford. And, you know, at times like this, words can't really describe how you feel, you know, for a 14-year-old young man to have lost his life at Clifton Country Park. And, you know, my thoughts and my prayers are with all those friends of Adam and his family at this time. Yeah, I mean, it is really heartbreaking what has happened, but yeah, my thoughts and prayers are with everyone at this time. So thanks for your kind words as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about obviously my portfolio and the areas I'm responsible for within the combined authority. Colleagues will have known that since the lockdown, one of the significant challenges that Greater Manchester faced was accommodating everyone into properties that was compliant with public health advice and guidance during the pandemic. And we've actually helped to engage 1,894 people who were experiencing homelessness and rough sleeping within Greater Manchester. And that number is compiled not just by looking at those who were impacted at the point of lockdown, but people over the pandemic we've been continuing to help and support. There is ongoing challenges because obviously we now need to step down from everyone in and find suitable COVID compliant accommodation for people who are experiencing homelessness and rough sleeping within Greater Manchester. And we still have 596 individuals to accommodate. So work is still ongoing to ensure we have accommodation for those individuals. Colleagues will probably be aware that on Friday of last week, the Combined Authority 10 leaders and Mayor Burnham agreed a paper that we took to the Combined Authority to agree for Bed Every Night Phase 3. And that sees an investment of in the region of £4.75 million going into Bed Every Night Phase 3. It includes 60 beds as well for individuals with no recourse to public funds, which I think is an important point because we have been seeing challenges across districts across Greater Manchester with regards to that. And obviously this is to procure COVID-19 safe, compliant accommodation moving forwards, acknowledging some of the challenges around shared accommodation. I think it's important to note and put on record that since 2018, we've seen over 3,000 people who've been supported through Bed Every Night. Bed Every Night does not stand alone. It supports all the work we're doing through the Rough Sleeper Initiative, Housing First, and also the work that the districts are doing as well. For me, though, there is a real challenge around Bed Every Night, and thanks to the goodwill of the institutions and organisations in Greater Manchester, we've managed to secure this funding moving forward. But we do need sustainable funding to ensure this is in place for the future. And certainly when we look at the COVID-19 emergency funding that's come into Greater Manchester from the government, we've seen a reduction between tranche 1 and tranche 2 of £11.89 million. I know my own city council saw a near 20% reduction on the funding received from government. So although we've managed to get ABEN Phase 3 in place, we do need sustainable funding moving forward to protect the most vulnerable in society. And anyone who was listening to the Combined Authority on Friday will know that looking at the local authorities and the Combined Authority over the next 12 months, we're looking at a budget pressure of in excess of £400 million at this point in time. Obviously, I acknowledge the numbers change all the time, but sustainable funding to support these vital services is going to be critical moving forward. One of the things we've been working on the last few weeks is also establishing a business case to submit to the government by the end of this week. We welcome obviously Dame Louise Casey's role in terms of heading up the Rough Sleeper COVID-19 task force, and we will be making a business case submission to the government by the end of this week to hopefully access that secure funding to see this mainstreamed in the future. Do still have some significant concerns, and I think it's worth just dwelling on some of those for a moment. Obviously, there's the 3 months evictions ban that's currently in place. That comes to an end on the 25th of June. I am concerned about the implications of that, because obviously we're talking about the people we're dealing with at the moment, but potentially we could see another wave of people presenting to our services across Greater Manchester as homeless and as having to apply the legislation and the duties, and then potentially if those duties don't apply in the way that gets them into temporary accommodation, then we'll have to be accommodating them through ABEN Phase 3. Also, local housing allowance, although I welcome the government's announcement to increase that, as well as universal credit, we're still not at the 50th percentile that we saw back in 2011. So many people in Greater Manchester still can't access accommodation in the private rented sector if they're dependent upon local housing allowance. Myself and Mayor Burnham, also off the back of our submission to a select committee inquiry looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the private rented sector and on homelessness, also highlighted some concerns around welfare, where increases in the local housing allowance and also universal credit won't necessarily benefit people who are caught by the benefit cap and the 2-child allowance within universal credit. Real concerns there, because those are individuals often with families of children who are being disproportionately impacted by these welfare regulations, if you like. In addition to that, I've already highlighted, we have ongoing concerns around no recourse to public funds, and part of our ask in our select committee submission was to ask government certainly for a humanitarian aid support to support those individuals within Greater Manchester. Right to buy continues to apply and is significantly impacting Greater Manchester. Over 90,000 properties now have been purchased since 1980. Many of those have not been replaced, and many of those have found their way into the private rented sector, where we know we have some real challenges with housing decency. Although not every landlord is caught up in that, we do have some challenges to tackle in Greater Manchester. At the moment, we have nearly 100,000 households on our housing waiting list. 30,000 of those are actually in urgent need. So that gives you some indication of some of the challenges moving forward. And obviously, as we start thinking about living with COVID-19 and recovering from COVID-19, we're acutely aware of what will be the economic impacts of all of this on people in Greater Manchester. Government recently also consulted on first homes, and I just want to draw colleagues' attention to the fact that Shelter are suggesting that they're out of reach for many average earners. 96% of the country, they think, won't be able to access that if you're an average earner. 63% of renters have no savings. And we know in Greater Manchester, we already have significant viability challenges, which will impact on Section 106 developer contributions moving forward. We welcome the government's announcement around an extra 3,300 homes to tackle homelessness over the next 12 months, which has been brought forward, I understand, and an allocation of 160 million from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. But when you consider that figure in line with 30,000 people already on our housing waiting lists in urgent need, then 3,300 over 12 months doesn't even begin to scratch the surface in terms of genuinely meeting need in many respects. This is an opportunity for us, though. COVID is now our moment, if you like, to deliver on our housing strategy within Greater Manchester, to build back better and fairer, and deliver some of those key policy principles that we've articulated in the housing strategy. Tackling homelessness, embracing modern methods of construction, assistive technologies, embracing community-led housing, delivering on our priority around net zero carbon homes from 2028, and importantly, certainly for me, delivering 50,000 affordable homes over the period of the GMSF. This is a real opportunity, and for me, we should embrace that and start doing things differently and building back better and fairer for the people of Greater Manchester. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. Thank you, Bev, too. So I'll hand over to Ross to moderate the questions that have come in. Ross.
Thanks very much, Andy. I'm going to go to a question from Nigel Barlow about Manchester. It's a question for Bev. Yesterday, a report came out that nationwide the COVID crisis was being used as an opportunity for gangs to recruit vulnerable youngsters, an opportunity made worse by the closure of diversionary projects and specialist service, both of which help young people exit gangs safely. Nigel's asking, do we have any evidence of this happening across the region, and how important is it that these services get back on their feet to support young people?
Thank you, Nigel. This is a really important issue, not only the vulnerability to gangs trying to groom young people into county lines and such like, but also the general safeguarding of vulnerable children and young people. And it's been of great concern since the start of this crisis, because obviously those children continue to be at risk. and yet they're not in school, they're not in places where adults that normally come into contact with them, responsible adults, can keep a check on them, nor meeting up with adults to whom they could disclose problems if they were happening to them. So it's been very high on our list of priorities, working with the police, but also with the local authorities, the directors of children's services, and done a number of things to try and mitigate those risks, so that those vulnerable children that aren't turning up into school, and there are significant numbers of them not turning up into school, arranging for them to be telephoned regularly, either by a social worker or by a teacher. Where we can, and we've got projects either through the Violence Reduction Unit or through Operation Challenger, which is our multi-agency approach to this kind of gang level criminal activity, where we've got projects jointly with voluntary organisations. We've tried wherever possible to continue some of that contact with children online and on the phone, and some of the projects that we're funding, which I've seen, have actually been able to do that, engaging with young people virtually. So it's not ideal. It's not what we'd like to be doing, and we're very mindful of the greater risk to them at this circumstance. But we are doing absolutely everything we can to mitigate that risk through those kinds of measures. Thanks.
Thanks, Bev. I'm going to go to a question for Andy from Dean Sampson at Roch Valley Radio. He said that Chris Boardman yesterday released a graph showing the changes in transport usage across Greater Manchester. This showed a clear increase in cycling. If this continues, and with cars slowly returning to our roads, can the GM road network cope with both the increased cycling and the ever-increasing motor traffic?
It's a good question, Dean, because it would be extremely challenging, no doubts about that. But let's celebrate the figures first. There is a huge increase in the number of people cycling, and that's obviously to be applauded. It's good to see people taking advantage of the quieter roads, and the challenge is obviously to keep more people cycling on a regular basis. So how do we manage things? Well, as I say, it is going to be very challenging because we need to find road space for both. Our councils have been looking at designating more road space, some on a temporary basis, to cycling provision, and so that is one way that we're trying to create more safe space for people. Of course, we have our plans for the B network, which is about creating segregated cycling provision across Greater Manchester. But how more broadly do we cope with all of the pressure on the transport system, given that it's going to be potentially dealing with more pressure because maybe more people might be thinking of turning to their car? I mean, obviously the cycling provision is one incentive for them not to do that and to consider active travel. But a bigger answer is to reshape the Greater Manchester working day. And I think that's something we're going to have to do now. We've talked about it before, but I think now we actually have to do it, i.e. move away from a very traditional 9 to 5 working day when everyone's on the roads at the same time. Just a small drop in traffic during half term creates a really big benefit for everybody. And I'm going to be working with businesses to say, look, as we bring people back to the office in the city centre, let's really rethink the structure of the working day, get staggered start and end times to the working day so that we spread things much more. And I think that is probably the main way in which we can manage the pressure that we're going to see on our transport system in the coming period. But I think we should celebrate the increase in cycling, and I'm really proud that our councils have stepped forward to create new space for those cyclists with some of the temporary measures that they've been putting in place.
Thanks, Andy. A question that will go to Bev from Adam Clark at Roch Valley Radio. Paul may want to come in. The question is, we saw reports yesterday that there were members of the public jumping off the Detroit Swing Bridge into Salford Quays, and he's asking, will there be an increased police presence in the area and what future measures are being taken? I think you're muted, Bev.
Yeah, I'm muted. Yeah, thank you, Adam. In fact, Mayor Dennett raised this at the COVID Emergency Committee with other leaders this morning, and Ian Hopkins, the Chief Constable, was in that meeting, and he heard that. And we had a general discussion, and I mean, certainly there will be increased patrols around those areas where dangerous activity like that is shown to be happening, and local areas will be talking to their neighbourhood police officers around what are the priorities for increased patrols. Having said that, the police can't be everywhere at once, so we do need to get some wider messages across to the public, as I was saying earlier, about continuing the need for public health safety, but also in this instance, just general safety in terms of not engaging in those kinds of dangerous activities. And we will be getting more messages out through our media around those kinds of activities.
Thanks, Bev. I'm not sure if Paul wants to add anything to that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you very much for the question, Adam. And like Baroness Hughes, I raised it on the COVID call earlier today. For me, I think it's really important that we still maintain the public health messaging here, because certainly the images that residents have been sharing with me, people are not maintaining physical distancing whilst they're out and about. And you cite the example of Detroit Bridge. I've seen all the images that residents have shared with me of, large numbers of, by and large, younger people congregating on those bridges, which has deeply concerned me. I've raised it with the police myself, and I've raised it with public health officials. But I think that the point around messaging is really important, because the advice as it stands currently is that we should stay at home as much as we possibly can, and that we should be physically distancing. I know often we talk about socially distancing, and I don't think that's terribly helpful in some respects, because what we're actually talking about here is physically distancing. We still want people to interact with each other, in different ways. But, some of the national messaging, I can't help but think is also being undermined by the behaviours of individuals. I'm thinking about people like Professor Ferguson and Dominic Cummings as well more recently. But yeah, we do need to work, and we are working collaboratively within Greater Manchester to strengthen that messaging. We're also, as we always do every year, working on some safe water kind of messaging for the summer periods. This is something we do regularly, and that is work that's already in train. And I think the Fire and Rescue Service have already indicated in some of their messaging around, safety around water, certainly during those summer months. But that's something we'll be doing in the very near future as well. So I think that's all I'd like to say. But there is a real partnership approach, working with local authorities, GMP, GMFRS, ward councillors, neighbourhood management in the city of Salford to try and tackle these issues, acknowledging that, our approach to policing is policing by consent.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm going to take a few questions for Andy, because I'm just conscious of the time. The first question is the second part of Adam's question from Roch Valley Radio, asking Metrolink has frequencies increased over the past week, and looking at the graph that Chris Boardman issued, it looks like there's an increase of a couple of % between Tuesday and Saturday of last week. And is there any data you could share with us? Also, Andy, if you could take Kevin Fitzpatrick's question from Radio Manchester. He understands that the spatial framework plan is being delayed and revised again to reflect the impact of COVID. What will that revision consider, and what's the estimated publication date? And also, if you get any update on the bus reforms, as we would expected, decision time has already passed on that.
Thanks, Ross. And thank you, Adam, for your question. You're right, it's increasing by a small number of percent, the patronage on Metrolink, Adam. So the figure I can give you is not probably expressed in the way that you want, but the latest figure I have, and this is for Monday this week, the 1st of June, is that Metrolink usage is down 91% on what it would ordinarily be. But if you go back a month or so ago, it was down 95%. So there's a small increase, small return to Metrolink. But because capacity is so constrained, obviously it's still a real challenge even at those levels. So we are going to increase the frequency now to a 6-minute service as soon as possible, and that will take place. We hope around the 20th, maybe a little bit after, but we're working very hard on that. Just to give you transport figures more broadly, the number of journeys by all modes into the regional centre, into the city centre, are currently 43% down on what they would ordinarily be. But if you go back a week ago, they were 47% down. So what that says is people are slowly returning to their commute, and that I expect that will continue to increase. So it's not increasing dramatically; it's creeping up on all modes. In terms of cars, private vehicles, they're down 35% on Monday's figure on what they would ordinarily be on a comparable day in normal times. So that was 36% down last week. So it's again creeping up. And that's the picture on transport at the moment. On the spatial framework, Kevin, it's not necessarily a decision to delay it. It's almost, in some ways, like everything at the moment, we're having to review it in the light of the new reality that we're all facing. Obviously, the economy is going to be facing a really challenging period. There's no doubt about that, and that will have implications for the spatial framework and obviously the delivery, particularly the 5-year delivery plan that would sit within it. We expect it to have an impact on high streets, so maybe that will open up more opportunity for residential build in brownfield areas. So it's really important that, well, we have to take account of the new reality that we're going into, but we have a clear commitment from our leaders to progress with a spatial framework. It's a real challenge, as you know, but we don't shirk it in any way. And one of our local MPs this week was kind of criticising the slow pace. Well, I think most residents would want us to take account of the new economic reality that we're going into, rather than just rushing on with a plan, particularly at a time when people aren't able particularly to engage in a consultation. I think we'd be accused of bulldozing it on at the wrong time. So we are taking stock of things. That's the right thing to do, but the commitment to bringing forward a spatial framework remains. On your second question around bus reform, it's in a similar category. We've got to take account of the new circumstances that we find ourselves in. We wanted to make a decision by the end of March with regard to the future of buses in Greater Manchester. Now that sadly was taken away from us by lockdown, but it's the view of all of the leaders that we want to get back as quickly as possible to taking a decision on the future of buses in Greater Manchester. So we are looking at that at the moment. We are wanting to obviously take account of the new market conditions that we see in the bus system. We are, of course, also discussing this with government, but we hope to accelerate the process of bus reform coming out of this, because I think this is, while a challenge, an opportunity to improve the public transport system from a clean air point of view, but also from an integration point of view. So, you know, it's going to be delayed, but absolutely not indefinitely. We want to get back to making a decision on this as soon as we possibly can.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to bring Paul in on the GMSF question, but also there's a direct question for you from Kevin Fitzpatrick as well, Paul. How is COVID-19 affecting work to ensure high-rise residents are safe from fires?
Okay, I'll take the GMSF one first, if that's okay. So it's interesting because obviously we know government have indicated that they're going to be changing the local housing need methodology as well for calculating housing numbers. So we've been told that that should be coming out around summertime or autumn. So some of this is clearly the responsibility of national government. Government, as well as we know, are committed to their own arbitrary housing target, in my opinion, of 300,000 homes per year by mid-2020. We've asked for the methodology they've used to calculate that. That's neither been forthcoming either. So I just think it's important to acknowledge on GMSF that we are waiting for this information so we can pursue proper strategic planning in Greater Manchester. In addition to that, colleagues will know that we still don't have the SDS regulations laid to allow us to pursue that strategy for the GMSF. So there are some real challenges, operational challenges, that actually sit with national government in terms of moving this forward. We've always been clear this is a really important strategy for Greater Manchester in terms of preparing us for the future. But we've got to be absolutely clear that this is evidence-based and evidence-led, because this will need to be defended at public inquiry. So those would be the comments I would make on the GMSF, because I think some of the responsibility around progressing some of this actually sits with national government. In terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the work of the Greater Manchester High Rise Task Force, I have to say, even with the pandemic, there has been a lot of work progressing, and you've probably seen numerous announcements from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and the recent release of the prospectus around how different blocks in different parts of the country can access that £1 billion worth of funding for removal and replacement of cladding and insulation. We're currently on in Greater Manchester with issuing a public letter to highlight some of our concerns with that fund. I did raise these on Friday at the combined authority, but I have to say work is still continuing, and we're using technology to make sure the Greater Manchester High Rise Task Force continues to meet and works through all the information that government is sharing as it progresses this issue nationally. We have some real concerns around the fund. We don't think it's anywhere near enough in terms of what's required. There's also dates being used in terms of when people can actually bid for funds and people not being eligible. You've probably seen the developments with regards to the Skyline building in Manchester. So we are going to be writing to the Secretary of State and relevant ministers and the Local Government Association on these issues to try and get some traction and hopefully be heard around our concerns with the fund moving forward. But I have to say the High Rise Task Force, in terms of its work, is continuing in earnest. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to go to a question from Joseph at the Bolton News and Bury Times, and put it to Andy first. What is the impact of the coronavirus on staffing levels in the fire service currently? And has this had an impact on the ability to tackle the moorland fires? Are you concerned about staffing levels if the fires continue throughout the summer?
Well, thanks, Joseph. I think maybe the Deputy Mayor will have the up-to-date figures on staffing levels. But it's obviously the case that the outbreak of fires on the moors, as we've seen in recent days, places massive strain on Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, but also neighbouring fire services as well. And it's an act of outrageous selfishness, to be honest, for people to go out on the moors, light fires, and then the huge drain on public resources, the danger to frontline staff that results from this, and of course to communities. So the point that I just wanted to make in response to this question, and then I'll bring the Deputy Mayor in, is that I think the time has come for stronger national legislation on this. I think Parliament needs to act. Currently, it's bylaws, local bylaws, local protection orders that are governing fires on open moorland. I think we need legislation that makes the use of a barbecue on open moorland a criminal offence, and I believe it needs to be accompanied by a very severe penalty, because the damage that can be done by this in terms of the cost to the public purse, the threat to communities, the risks to staff is so great that we simply cannot allow the recurrence of the situation that we keep seeing every summer. So I think we need a change in the law, so it's a piece of national legislation setting out strict penalties, and I would call on our MPs to support that. I'm not prepared to see our fire service battle this without the support they need any longer.
Thanks, Andy. I'll bring Bev in on this point as well, but also on Joseph's first question, which says large gatherings, antisocial behaviour and flouting of the lockdown rules were reported at Rivington near Horwich and Moses Gate Country Park at the weekend. Are you concerned that this type of behaviour will continue, and does it contribute to concerns of a second peak? Okay,
thank you very much, Joseph. On the fire service, we're very lucky that the level of sickness absence linked to COVID-19 is very low now in the fire service. It's about 1.69% of the uniformed staff, and even less for the support staff. So as of the 31st of May, it's the latest figures that I've got, all 50 pumps were on the run, and we were not having to take any pumps off the run day and night. That said, the impact of a number of very significant fires at the same time is really significant. At the peak of demand across the fires we talked about, there were 10 taken out of responding to local incidents. So that's significant. And I think the second point I'd make is that, you know, the fighting of that kind of fire in very, very high temperatures on very rough terrain also takes its toll on the people doing it. So I just echo the Mayor's point that it really is an act of the most awful self-indulgence and danger for people to risk starting fires in that kind of situation. And it has a great impact on the service and potentially for other local people who might need a fire engine. So it's really, really very serious. On the second question on large gatherings, obviously, I think we are all concerned about that. It's what we've been talking about in part today with the leaders. I think we had a kind of maelstrom of difficult circumstances over recent weeks, a combination of people feeling the lockdown was gone, very, very good weather, people wanting to socialise, drinking a lot, all contributed to all of that. The weather's changed, that might have an impact, but we can't be complacent. And I think we've got to send the message out that those kinds of gatherings and that kind of social activity in such large numbers with people very close together is dangerous. It's dangerous in health terms. Yes, it does risk a second spike. Because we know, as the Mayor said, in terms of the statistics in Greater Manchester, this illness is still being transmitted. We're still getting new cases. It's not on a downslide yet. And therefore, I think there is a risk of a second spike. And that would be very, very serious for us, I think.
Thanks, Bev. There's two questions, one from Tom Dambach at Hits Radio and one from Michael Gaffney, and we'll bring Andy in after you. But the question from Tom is, we're seeing a large number of Black Lives Matters protests, of course, still during the pandemic. How important is it to balance the right to protest with the need for social distancing? And a very similar question from Michael, what measures have been taken to ensure social distancing remains in place during these protests? We'll bring in Andy after you.
Look, we had quite a discussion about this as well this morning, and I think the point was well made. You know, the right to peaceful protest is something that we would always support, and I think this absolutely shocking incident, it's understandable, and I share people's desire to make a statement about what's happening in America and to show solidarity with those sections of our community here. So absolutely support that. But I just say to people, do that in a way that reflects the concerns about the health situation that we're in at the moment. There was a protest walk by Black Lives Matter last weekend. That was conducted very peacefully in a very orderly way. I've no doubt at all that if further events of that kind take place this weekend or beyond, it will happen in the same way. The police themselves have good relationships with members of the community. They've got a well-established and very open way of approaching the discussions around protest walks and marches with the organisers, and they will do the same as they always do. And I've no doubt here that if there is another protest walk, it will be managed well, and that the people engaged on the walk will conduct themselves as we'd want them to.
Thanks, Bev. I'll bring Andy in on that point as well, but there's also a question for Andy on a similar topic. Or actually, I think we'll take that one later. I think we'll just stick with Black Lives Matter at the moment.
Not a great deal to add, Ross, other than the fact that the 10 leaders agreeing to light up buildings, I hope, is a safe way of sending a very strong message over to our friends in Minneapolis and the US of how Greater Manchester feels about these things. And I'll be writing to the Mayor of Minneapolis later today, sharing the statement that the leaders have agreed, the strong statement that they've agreed that I alluded to at the start. So, you know, I want people here to know, you know, of course, we always support people's right to protest, but at this time, as Deputy Mayor says, it's got to be done in a way that doesn't endanger anybody's health. But you know, we are with you. We're sending the same message, and the more we send that message in a way that is kind of respecting each other, respecting each other's health, I think that message carries more weight if it goes in that way. So, you know, we're grateful for the way people conducted themselves at the weekend, but, you know, let's just not make this a moment for protest. Let's make it a moment for change too.
Thanks, Andy. A question from Michael Gaffney at Heart and Smooth Radio. Following yesterday's figures on the increased risk to BAME communities from COVID-19, what will Greater Manchester's health and social care system be doing to ensure people from minority backgrounds are supported through the pandemic?
Well, that's a very important question, and I was pleased this morning that we had the North West Regional Director for Public Health England address our meeting, so leaders had a chance to discuss this very issue with him. The underlying health inequalities in our country obviously are now evident, very much so, in the way the virus has sadly attacked the most deprived communities, and that's for a whole range of reasons. But I can understand today how people in our Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities are feeling concerned by what they read yesterday, and particularly the Bangladeshi community who were singled out to be at the greatest risk of all of those communities. And this issue has been discussed by leaders today, and we want to act quickly to reassure people. So there will be efforts to put extra messaging out to particular communities. But also, I want to consider how we can use the emerging test and trace system in Greater Manchester to provide extra confidence to those communities. That if there is an outbreak, it will be dealt with very, very quickly. So there are things that we need to do, as well as understanding the structural inequalities that cause the virus to be more prevalent in some communities than others, particularly linked to poor housing and often overcrowded housing as well. So we're taking it extremely seriously. We've agreed with Public Health England that we will kind of develop our response to this in partnership with them. But I think, you know, today there's a need to reassure our communities that we are taking the report very seriously. We are considering what we can do immediately to provide reassurance, but of course working with Public Health England on the longer term structural issues.
Thanks, Andy. There's two questions about local lockdowns. First one's from Rob England at BBC News at 2:26. So to follow up your comments on local lockdowns, you mentioned it's currently unclear who would choose which areas are put into lockdown. What guidance have you had so far from government on this? Also, has the government given you any indication of the range of restrictions you could impose in an area if you're unable to contain an outbreak? And what should people expect to hear and see if an outbreak is identified? There's also a similar question from Jennifer Williams just underneath that one, which says, you've said that Greater Manchester doesn't really know what a local lockdown means, but you plan to design your own principles. So what in practical terms do leaders see here as this meeting in practice? Could we see a part of a borough lockdown under GM measures? And if not, what kind of area are we talking about? What would the lockdown look like in terms of restrictions, and who would enforce it? Could there be fines?
Well, thanks, Rob, and thanks, Jen. They're very good questions, and it's hard to answer them because we don't have that detail from the government on what a local lockdown policy, as they see it, would work in practice. We don't have in the public domain yet that regional or localized information that would be used to justify such a policy. We are not clear how the Biotech Security Centre at national level will identify areas with the greatest issues to address. It's not clear whether local authorities would be asked to make the decision, or whether the decision would be an instruction from a higher level. How would local authorities be funded to run this? So there are huge questions that fall out of this, and so therefore it's kind of hard really to answer the practicalities, because we just don't know. And this is part of the problem, to throw out something as potentially worrying as a local lockdown to people without the detail, I think is wrong. What you were kind of hearing me convey before was the skepticism, if you like, from the GM system about how this could possibly work in practice. Leaders made the point that people cross our boundaries every day to go to work. If you were to put a community under lockdown, how on earth would people who need to work within those communities, how would they manage if they weren't able to go to work? Would there be a local furlough scheme to support them? See, none of these questions have been answered, and just in general terms, we just think that the very notion of putting a community or part of it under lockdown is highly problematic. What we would prefer is a system that's based on more localized information, so that we can empower the public and work with the public to manage the risks that their community may face. If it is focused on closure of particular premises, that's a different thing, and maybe that's a policy that we could work with the government on. But the notion of more generalised local lockdowns, I think, is not supported by the leaders across Greater Manchester. And we need to see the government come at this in a different way and allow areas like ours to develop our own principles about how we would manage this, working with our own communities.
Thanks, Andy. There's 3 more questions. Obviously, we're running on slightly, but we'll run on to get these 3 answered. It's a question for Bev from Niall Griffiths. Earlier, you said crime levels were on the rise. Do you have any specific figures or percentages for these increases and how it compared to pre-lockdown levels? It's the final question from Niall Griffiths.
Okay, thanks, Niall. I can't give you percentages today, but I get a daily report from the police, and we look at that on a weekly basis as well. And so we see that the nature of incidents is, of all crime types really, is rising steadily. They are still below, pre-COVID business as usual levels, but they are definitely rising. Apart from domestic abuse, which has remained steady, it didn't fall, it's remained steady, and it still remains steady. But we will at some point in the future be producing some aggregate figures in percentage terms. But for the moment, that is what we're seeing day to day.
Thanks, Bev. Question for Andy from Nigel Barlow about Manchester. Yesterday, a report from MMU suggested that even with less cars on the road, level of pollution, including particularly of nitrogen dioxide in the city centre, remains dangerously high even during the lockdown. What does this tell us about our strategy for clean air moving forward?
I suppose it tells us we've got a very big challenge, but we're ready to rise to that challenge, because the leaders last week at the combined authority meeting endorsed the proposal to move forward with a consultation later this year on a clean air zone, which will be the biggest in the country. Recognising that a localised approach would just displace that traffic and would take the problem elsewhere. So we are progressing our plans. We also want to see it accompanied with more pedestrianisation, more space for cyclists. It's going to be, I think, a moment of real change, and this is an area where Build Back Better will really mean something. I recognise that there's lots of pressure on people with regards to finances, particularly taxi drivers, small businesses. It's why we're also increasing our ask to the government for funding to help people switch their vehicles. So the whole drive towards clean air in this period could become a way of both supporting businesses at the same time as clearing up the pollution. But yeah, we shouldn't be under any illusions about the scale of the task. And it's a frustration to us that Highways England are still being exempted from the Greater Manchester Clean Air Zone. We believe the government should include Highways England roads within the scheme so that we really can clean up the air once and for all.
Thanks, Andy. And just a final question to you from Jen Williams at the MEN. So after this, if you do have any final comments, are we getting Pillar 2 testing data through yet? If not, does this mean we still don't know how many people are testing positive for COVID here?
As I understand it, Jen, that is still the case. So we get numbers of people who've had tests, but as I understand it, we don't get the data on the outcome of that test or the demographic, geographical data about people's location, etc. So there is some data, but it is of limited value, is the best way to describe it. Although I understand there are plans to improve the quality of that Pillar 2 testing data in terms of its use in Greater Manchester. So I think it's work in progress, but as I understand it, it's of very limited value, the information that we get as part of Pillar 2 testing.
That's us in terms of questions. So if you, Paul or Bev, have any final comments, and that's us.
Yeah, go to Paul first, Bev, then I'll say something briefly, Ross, thanks.
No, I'd just like to thank colleagues for the questions that they've raised. Obviously, we are now starting to think about living with COVID, recovering from COVID, and certainly myself in my brief, it creates a lot of opportunities for us to tackle the housing and homelessness crisis. And we need to work with government and partners within Greater Manchester to truly deliver on our housing strategy and our aspirations as already articulated. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Just 2 quick points from me. I'm personally really pleased that we took the decision today to make the statement around Black Lives Matter that Andy's referred to, and the albeit limited, but the action of solidarity we can show towards the weekend. And I just feel that's really, really important for us in Greater Manchester to do that, and I'm pleased to be a part of that. Secondly, thank you for your interest, and also anything you can do to reinforce the message that I do think we need to get back to, which is the importance of, taking those measures we can to avoid transmitting this illness. So sticking to physical distance of less than 2 meters, no large groups, no groups of more than 6, not going in other people's houses, and just really being mindful of the fact that it's still very easy to catch this disease. Thank you.
Yes, just to absolutely follow on from what Bev just said, 190 new cases in Greater Manchester, and that's just the Pillar 1 data. So obviously it could be higher when we add in the other tests carried out as well. So think about that. That's 190 families in Greater Manchester in the last week who've become worried about things. There's a very real and present danger. Position where there is more clarity and confidence in the government's public health messaging. This threat has not gone away. We are in a new world as people are emerging from lockdown, but we need to re-emphasize how people need to take great care. They need to be vigilant and make changes in a very careful way, rather than any quick changes. We also need to empower people more, and I think this, in the new world that we're in now, this is a kind of theme that we just need to keep pressing. Empower people with information about what is happening in their community, what's happening in their region, because the picture varies quite widely from one place to another. Given the government has gone in this way and has relaxed lockdown in the way that they have, I think that the thing that needs to happen now is to put information in the hands of the people and trust their judgment to do the right thing. The vast majority have done the right thing all the way through this. They continue to want to do the right thing, but they'll be better able to do that if they have more up-to-date information on the real picture on the ground in their community or in their region. And that call I'm making, I've been making it for a number of weeks now, it's becoming quite an insistent call on the government. It's much better to talk about empowering people with information rather than talking about local lockdowns, which I think could have the effect of alienating communities. And often the communities that might be subject to a lockdown will be the communities that already face the greatest challenges. So, work with us on this is my message to the government today.